What's up, friends? Welcome to my first quarterly reading wrap-up of the year. January through March were not my best reading months, to put it lightly. Work has been stupidly busy this year, and I went through a major career change in January too that I feel like I'm still adjusting to. I just have not had the energy or the emotional capacity to enjoy books as much, so I've just been in a slump. I think I'm still in a slump. But for January through March, I think 13 books to talk about today, and at least half of them are books that I didn't even finish. Before we get started, let me give you a really basic rundown of my personal star rating system. 5 stars, perfect. I love her. I'm carving a little space for her in my heart. I don't want to hear any criticisms from anybody about her. 4 stars, she's great. Not the perfect book for me. I have some criticisms, but if someone were to tell me that this was a 5-star book for them, I totally get it. I'm glad that I read this book. 3 stars, totally fine book, probably better suited for somebody else. My life would have been totally fine if I had never picked it up, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it wasted my time or anything. I'm unoffended by the space that it took up in my life. 2 stars, however, this actually did waste my time, and I'm actively upset that I spent my time reading this book instead of another book. But if I stretch my imagination, I guess I can understand why somebody else would have enjoyed the book more than I did. 1 star, this is a waste of everybody's time, and I don't understand how anyone could like the book. That's kind of reductionary, and you can see that it's very subjective. I try to be somewhat objective when rating, but at the end of the day, the rating just needs to sit right in my heart, you know? Starting this year, I have also started doing half-star ratings, which I used to never do before, but I switched over to StoryGraph instead of Goodreads this year, and it's changing me. I'm dabbling a little bit into it more, but the half-star ratings are even more of a subjective decision. Now we're going to start with all of the books that I picked up but did not finish, and then work our way up to the only 5-star read of the year so far. I DNF'd 7 books in the span of 3 months, about 50% of the books that I'll be talking about in this video, which feels like a lot, but in my defense, I was actively working on unhauling books, so I was picking up books that I was reasonably sure that I was ultimately going to get rid of, but still, it feels like a lot, right? The first one was The Monsters of Templeton by Lauren Groff. This book centers around the small town of Templeton, New York. Through alternating timelines, we get to see the founding of the town and then the struggles of the founders' descendants centuries later. Willie Upton, said descendant, had managed to escape the confines of her small town until a disastrous affair with her married archaeology professor made her tuck tail and run all the way back to Templeton to hide away in the ancestral home that her mother still lives in. Her return to Templeton coincides with 2 things that turns Willie's perception of the town upside down. The first being that her mother reveals that Willie's father is not actually some random stranger that they never saw again, but actually a local that is still in town. And 2, a strange, massive monster rises from the town's lake dead. I'm disappointed by this book because I feel like at a different time or written by a different author, it really could have been such a great read for me. It survived so many unhauls. I kept it for so many years because I kept hoping that I would pick it up at just the right time, and it never happened. I'm going to give you something that's maybe considered a spoiler by some people, but I don't really think so because we learn about it very early on in the book. It's kind of central to the premise, but fair warning for anyone who doesn't want to know anything more than what I've already said. Willie finds out that she is pregnant with her professor's baby. There was great potential here for the monster in the lake to be an allegory for pregnancy, and of course there's the connection between Willie being an archaeologist and her investigating her own genealogy, trying to find her father, while she's actively adding to the same family tree that she's studying. Just every aspect of the story could have weaved together to have a very strong message about family and ancestry, and maybe it did, but I didn't get far enough to see that because the book just didn't hook me. Let's start with the professor that Willie was hooking up with. Grossly described. And not even in a taking advantage kind of way, but gross in a I'm begging you to have higher standards for yourself kind of way. And then there were crazy narrative choices made with the historical timeline chapters. I say chapters, but I think I actually decided to DNF this book after I read 1 chapter in the past timeline because I just couldn't put up with it after that. The author establishes that a scandalous secret about the founder was exposed a while ago. This is again revealed during the setup to the novel. We find out that Willie's mother was actually descended on both sides from the founder because the founder had a secret child with a slave woman that he owned. Anyone with any sense immediately thinks of sexual assault because that would be the historically accurate truth. But instead, This author writes her as a willfully promiscuous seductress. She writes a POV chapter from the enslaved woman where she admits to intentionally seducing the master, says she feels beautiful while men are examining her naked body during a slave auction, and then herself justifies her previous mistress burning a circle of scars around her neck because Hetty had, after all, seduced the woman's husband, her slave owner. It's just wild. And mind you, everything that I just said happened in the span of quite literally one paragraph. I just have better things to do than to give this book the benefit of the doubt, if you know what I mean. This next book, As Old as Time by Liz Braswell, at least was not offensive. This is a part of the Disney Twisted Tales series where authors reimagine the classic Disney stories around one central question that would change the way the original story went. As Old as Time is based on Beauty and the Beast, of course, and the question that it considers is, what if the Beast had been cursed by Belle's mother? The chapters in this book alternate between Belle going through the storyline that we all know from the original Disney story and her mom Rosalind while she's pregnant with Belle. Rosalind is a young enchantress, and at the time of her pregnancy, anti-magic sentiments are at an all-time high. Other magical beings in town are disappearing or being snatched away, and Rosalind feels some responsibility to do something about it because most people are just ignoring the way the wind's blowing here. This book just wasn't interesting to me, which is kind of a bummer because Belle was my favorite Disney princess as a kid, but Belle's chapters were boring because it was just the movie being written out, which is kind of silly in writing. The Beast comes across as ridiculous with how often he yells, and his switches between yelling and polite behavior would give just about anybody whiplash. Rosalind's chapters were more interesting, but they were still disappointingly Disney-esque, which I understand is a ridiculous criticism to give, because this is a Disney-branded book, it is about a Disney story, and quite frankly, it was not written for me as the demographic of the reader. I understand that. But at a minimum, it was marketed as a YA book, and I just wish it would have been more mature than your classic Disney movie would be. It's very straightforward, it's very young in tone, it's going for a fairy tale vibe, but for me personally, I think it's missing a je ne sais quoi, some level of beautiful prose to really make it feel like a fairy tale. Of all the books that I DNF'd, I probably have the most neutral feelings about As Old as Time. I just think it wasn't made for me. This next book, The Merciless by Danielle Vega, my feelings about this are not neutral. In this book, Sophia is a high schooler new to town. Luckily, she gets adopted by the popular girls in school, and she is desperate to become close friends with them. These popular girls tell Sophia that they're worried about one of their former friends named Brooklyn. They are convinced that Brooklyn is possessed, and they want to help her. So Sophia is dragged into performing an exorcism that looks less like a religious ritual and more like actual torture. The Merciless is just aggressively 2010s. In the first 58 pages, we had black thick rimmed glasses with no lenses, if I'm remembering correctly, a band-aid with a mustache, and a bow tie necklace, and that's just what I'm remembering off the top of my head. I feel like the entire book was dripping in 2010s energy, and I just found it cringy. I also felt like it was trying too hard to push the creepy religious vibe, but it lacks subtlety or tension building. Just read Grady Hendrix's My Best Friend's Exorcism if you want a high school possession story. That one's much better. Next, we've got The Kitchen Boy by Robert Alexander. This is a historical novel focusing on the final days of the Romanov family in Russia. It's told from the perspective of the kitchen boy that was working in the house where the family was held captive and eventually murdered. This is what I would call a special interest book, as in you should really only read it if it happens to cover your special interest. I enjoyed it the first time I read it because I was knee deep in the middle of completing a Russian minor. So I was learning a ton about Russian culture at the time, and of course I was a big fan of the Anastasia movie, iconic movie, great soundtrack.
Dancing bears, painted wings, things I almost remember.
So yeah, obviously I was interested in a book about the Romanov family and whether it would play into the conspiracy theory about Anastasia surviving the murders. But this is more of a filler book. Nothing special on its own, but a nice cleanser in between reading denser books. It's quite short with an entertaining twist at the end. It's good for people who like books that reimagine history or try to fill the gaps. Also good for people who like fiction books written as memoirs or confessionals. Next, we've got The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. I don't know if I got that right. I'm really sorry. I think a lot of people have probably heard of the Witcher TV show show, which is the adaptation of this series. The Witcher series follows Geralt, a man with magical powers honed to fight and kill monsters for a price, of course. The Last Wish is essentially like a short story collection that takes place prior to the main storyline of the series that starts in the next book. If you want to read the whole series, though, I don't think that this one can be skipped because it sets the foundation for the world. You learn about Witchers and what their job is in slaying monsters. You learn of some of the political issues brewing in different kingdoms, and you learn about how girls born during a certain astronomical event years ago seem to have been cursed at birth, which I assume plays into the main storyline. I liked the show well enough. I haven't watched it since the main actor was switched out, but I did enjoy the show. I wanted to read the series, but I've just been unable to get past this first book. I didn't actually even choose to DNF this book. My library hold on it just expired and I didn't care enough to check it out again, which I think tells you a lot about how I felt about it. You get thrown into the worlds and the action right away, but at the core of it, it's still a short story collection, and I am simply not a short story person in general. I need time to get invested in things, and short stories are just not often long enough for me to actually get invested. It was an okay way to fill my time, but I got distracted as soon as there were other things that I could do instead. This was made especially true when I realized that some of the short stories were basically just monster retellings of stories that I already knew. One of the short stories was so blatantly Snow White that it dampened my enjoyment of it compared to other stories in the collection. Another was literally just Beauty and the Beast. And all of these retellings and the other stories in the book that I read were so obviously written with the male gaze in mind that I found myself exasperated. It feels like another book where I'd have to pretend to be chill about how uncomfortable the author's depiction of women is, and pretend like it's not sexist and weird to make comments on women's bodies the way that authors like this do, specifically on the bodies of girls who would be considered minors in our world. I do still find myself curious to know how the main storyline goes, so I'm kind of on the fence about maybe just skipping over this one and trying the main series out just to sate my own curiosity. But I don't know how much I care. There are so many other books that I could read instead. Next up is Elephant Run by Roland Smith. This is a middle grade book that takes place during World War II. Nick is a young boy in London who's sent away by his mother after the city is bombed. He gets sent to live with his father in Burma at the family's teak plantation. Japanese soldiers, however, invade the elephant village and take his father prisoner, and that is where the story takes off. This is really choppy writing. 50 pages in, and it was so dull. By that point in the story, we had already had war in the background. We had an elephant encounter. I think the invasion was just starting at that point, and yet with all of those things going on, it still managed to be boring. I'll admit that reading only 50 pages isn't always giving a book the most fair shot, but I think it's enough reading for me to decide if I'm intrigued enough to keep going, and I very much was not. This could be an interesting, different perspective on World War II, or it could turn out to be a low-key racist story that doesn't address the animal cruelty that elephants have historically faced. Now, I'm no expert, to be fair, but my impression is that the elephant industry has been a very bloody one, even if I'm sure there are people who genuinely care about them, and I just don't trust the author to do it justice. Very early on in the book, we have a carved ivory pocket knife that is significant to the character, and I just don't believe that this book would have even a passing mention about the illegal poaching that happens to acquire the ivory. Now for the last and most disappointing DNF, we have Katabasis by R.F. Kuang. Katabasis is about a graduate student, Alice Law, who is studying magic at Cambridge. Her future career is put at risk, however, when her advisor, Professor Grimes, dies in a magical accident and gets sent straight to hell. This is simply unacceptable. Alice needs Grimes's recommendation in order to get a job, so she's determined to travel to hell to retrieve Grimes, unfortunately alongside her academic rival Peter, who is in the same predicament as she is. This is an upsetting, but in hindsight, unsurprising DNF. A soft DNF though. I have every intention of picking this book up again at a later time. I think the tone and style of this book just surprised me so much that I found it more jarring than a story that I could sink into. I expected it to have a similar tone to Babel because that's also an academia-based story. But the main thing it had in common with Babel is that it was so not what I expected that I felt like I needed to DNF it for now and come back to it at a later point with my eyes fully wide open about what I could expect from this story. I just found Katabasis to be more abrupt in its pacing than any of the other stories that I've read from her, which might be all of them. them. I think I've read every R.F. Kuang up to Katabasis. Things in this book were moving fast, but not in a way that I would call it edge of your seat action-packed pacing. Instead, it felt like a list of notes to hit, not something that organically flowed from one event to the next. On one page, we're setting up a ritual to get to hell. On the next page, our supposed academic rival is now coming with us, and now we're in hell. And on the next page, we're in limbo. But oh wait, no, we're in the line to get to the next area of hell. Nope, now we're scaling a wall. That's how that feels. And I'm not calling any of those spoilers, because I'm not saying many details, but more importantly, because this all happens within the first 10% of the book. It is back to back, only made longer with interjections of info dumping. The style of it actually made me think of the only Olivia Blake book that I've ever read, Master of Death, which I found so disappointing because it didn't execute an interesting concept the way that I would have wanted it to. And right now, I feel the same way about Katabasis. I wish the book had been written as if it were a field journal. I kind of feel like R.F. Kuang wanted this to be written as if it were a field journal or a fantasy textbook actually, and just didn't commit to that format. The little part of Katabasis that I read spent a lot of time mentioning different stories that reference hell. In this world, all of those stories, Dante's Inferno, the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, etc., all of those are all treated like the recountings of people who actually went to hell. And with those stories and our main characters' personal observations in hell, we get a lot of theories about how hell works in a practical sense, and that would have felt more interesting as a field journal. All of the things that feel weird in a regularly presented narrative style would make sense in a field journal format. It would explain the ratio of theorizing versus plot, which leans heavily towards theorizing, at least in the beginning. The more clear-cut and quick observations of actions would have felt more natural if it was just someone's notes that we were reading. It also would have allowed R.F. Kuang to linger more on the theories and descriptions of how hell works without it feeling like it was info dumping, because frankly, a field journal is meant to be kind of info dumping. Again, I only read like 12% of this book, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. I just feel like we would have lost nothing if this was in a field journal format, and we would have potentially gained a bunch from that. I also heard there's supposed to be a romance in this book, and let me tell you, at that point, when I DNF'd it, I didn't even feel anything for the individual characters, even when they were being supposedly vulnerable. At least with a field journal format, I would have expected to have to read between the lines and pick up on the emotions. I'll give it a few months, I'll pick it up again, and I'll just pretend that this was meant to be a field journal. And now we're skipping all the way to my 3-star reads. Thank God I did not have any 1- and 2-star reads this year so far. All right, we're starting with Heated Rivalry by Reid. This is an enemies to lovers romance between two rival hockey players. We've got Shane Hollander, captain of the Montreal Voyageurs, squeaky clean golden boy. And then you've got Ilya Rozanov, captain of the Boston Bears, and Shane's opposite in every way. But they're both insanely talented hockey players, basically the only real challenge for each other. The media hypes up their rivalry, the fans eat it up, but little do all of them know that behind closed doors, Shane and Ilya have been hooking up for ages. It's a secret that could ruin their careers. I picked this up because I also fell for the craze of the TV adaptation. You know how people often say you should read the book first and then watch the adaptation? Not in this case. In this case, you should 100% watch the show first and then read the book. Because if you enjoyed the show and you want another fix of this couple, then you'll have a fun time with this book. But if you read the book first, you may never give the show a try, and I think that would be a tragedy. And this feels weird to say because the show is almost exactly like the book. A lot of the dialogue is lifted verbatim out of the book, but there is a difference between them that isn't exactly easy to put my finger on. The book has the added benefit of showing you the inner thoughts for both Shane and Ilya, but it's not as strong as pulling the audience in closer and more intimately in an emotional sense. So much of their relationship is unspoken, and it translated so well on screen because the main actors for both of these characters killed it in the body language department. I think the show stays true to the spirit of the book, but every change that was made, usually minor, made the story richer and fuller. The characters felt more real in the show. I'd recommend the show and not necessarily the book. I will give credit to the book though for having a more balanced dynamic between the two love interests than the show does in my opinion, but I had a big issue with the writing style because I found it very basic, kind of boring, super repetitive sentence structure. I just at no point felt like this was a person who loved writing as a craft. They just wanted to get their fantasy out on the page and be done with it. I told my friend that I would have fully believed it if I was told that the entirety of Heated Rivalry was drafted in the author's notes app on their phone. It's really easy to fly through the story though, which is a compliment. If you want a light, fun time, this is great for that. For me, at times, I wish it had been less light. Reid kept writing up until what would be a really interesting theme to discuss, and then stalling out and not following through. At one point, Shane mentions that he's often called pretty, and it made me think about how how being an Asian man probably made being a gay man as well more difficult for Shane to accept. Because Asian men are so often feminized and called pretty boys and assumed to be gay, the racism and the homophobia really intersect there, and I have to imagine it would feel so frustrating to feel like you've played into stereotypes just by being yourself. I fully believe that Shane would have struggled with that, with feeling like he somehow has justified all of the slurs that people around him have used because he's turned out to be exactly what racist people think Asian men are like. And Rachel Reid touched on none of that. It does not go any further than Shane saying that people often call him pretty. She does discuss what it's like to come to terms with your sexuality and accept yourself, but in an LGBT story, especially one that starts when the characters are teenagers, that is a dime a dozen theme. Discussing more complex things like the intersection between homophobia and racism against Asian men is what would have made this book more unique. The fact that Ilya is a Russian man also could have added more complexity and depth to the story. He doesn't just have internalized homophobia, he has a whole country that thinks he is wrong for who he is. If I did my math right, I'm pretty sure Ilya was born during a time when homosexuality was still illegal in the country. Shane's over here struggling to come to terms with his sexuality. Why do we never have a even internal discussion about how Ilya is handling what his sexuality means for his life as a Russian citizen? It's very much just brushed aside. And while we're talking about brushed aside, there is also a throwaway event mentioned at like the very end of the book that is absolutely buck wild to summarize in one sentence. And if you've read the book, I think you'll know which one I'm talking about. I was disappointed by the lack of follow through, and what I've heard about book 2 does not make me hopeful that this is a flaw that has been improved upon. This book is entertaining enough but totally forgettable, and it's a bummer that there would be glimmers of what would make this story more interesting just to have Rachel Reid never mention them again. The pacing of this book is also kind of crazy. It moves really fast, and yet it also feels like we stay in the exact same stage of the relationship for the majority of the book before suddenly jumping over several stages of emotional buildup. I just really didn't emotionally connect with these characters the way that I did with the show. For those interested in knowing spice levels, the sex starts really early on and it never lets up. A huge chunk of this book is just sex scenes. Now, I'm personally not a spice girl myself. I find that sex scenes are often gratuitous and could easily be cut out without affecting the plot itself. That is totally not the case here. Sex is such an important part of their relationship. It's basically the only way they communicate for a majority of their relationship. So the scenes are important for seeing who they are beneath the surface level. You see Shane grow more comfortable in his sexuality. You see Ilya's softer side during these scenes. You also see their trust and intimacy with each other grow. This is maybe one of the only books where I would say the sex scenes are essential. I will read The Long Game and other books in this universe because they are super easy to fly through, but I really don't think that they're going to stick with me past the last page. All right, now the rest of the books in this section actually all got 3.5 stars, starting with All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders. This is about childhood friends Patricia and Lawrence who meet and bond as two awkward outcasts until circumstances make them part for years. While apart, Patricia becomes a witch and joins a group of magicians who secretly attempt to right all the increasing wrongs in the world as environmental disasters pile up. Lawrence, on the other hand, is a tech genius in a group of like-minded people who similarly see the world falling apart, but have a vastly different approach for how to fix that. Both groups are trying to save the world, but their clash in priorities may lead to a fight that actually ends up ending the world entirely. This story is about two people desperately trying to make things better, but not knowing how to go about that the right way. They are both trying to force themselves into spaces that don't quite suit them, and they both care a lot, but they're focused on different things. They just see the core of life and humanity differently. It's also about having the weight of people's expectations and hopes on your shoulders, and in the childhood portion of the story, it is also very much about bullying. Now, all of that is true, but imagine it more awkwardly conveyed than I have described it. All the Birds in the Sky has this quirky absurdness to it that reminds me of The Girl Who Saved the King of Sweden. Take that comparison with a grain of salt though, because I haven't read that book in like 7 years. This book just earnestly passes off silliness, especially in the beginning. There's a very sincere mention of an assassin convention where one of the breakout sessions is how to deal with social anxiety. It genuinely got a huff of implied laughter out of me a few times, so hats off for that. And now let's get into the criticisms of it though. It has a jumpy sort of style. Like, we'll start a conversation on the couch and all of a sudden it'll say, so and so said as they cross the street. And really, truly, when did we get up off of the couch? When did we decide to cross the street? Where are we going? You have not told me where we are going as we cross this street. Maybe some of you will consider this a nitpick, but for me, it sometimes really does impact my ability to get into a story if I can't place the characters and where they are. Events are also kind of jumbled up, which, to be fair, is somewhat the result of a major time skip and then having to recap what happened during the time skip. But even after we've basically caught up, it still feels like we jump a lot from event to event and skip across time a lot. And you may think that all this jumping around makes the book feel fast-paced. Wrong. We're told in the premise that there's going to be this great big war between both sides, but you really don't see it until very, very near the end, besides just a difference in approach. And even then, don't expect tension and fast-paced action like the premise might suggest. This story is more a meandering of two people who have come together and drifted apart over and over again across the years. I also personally found the emotional aspects removed. It feels like even when they're having emotional conversations, the readers are kept at a distance. Things pick up towards the end, but I mean like the very end. The resolution feels like it's just thrown in there in like the last 30 pages or so. It doesn't feel earned. It feels contrived, actually. That being said, I do think some people would really like this book. Some of you would find the writing style fun and endearingly quirky. Some of you will enjoy just being a part of these two people's lives, which you have to be, because this book is more about their lives than it is about any kind of war or battle. You might love all of the philosophical discussions that the two of them have together, and especially their own internal thoughts about trying to fit in and about trying to make the world a better place, because it's ultimately everyone's fault that it is the way that it is. This briefly made me think of The Magician's Show, and of course it's impossible to not at least think of This Is How You Lose the Time War for a second, you know, with one person on the side of nature and then one person on the side of tech. It's extremely different though. All the Birds in the Sky is very clear in its descriptions. You'll actually know what's going on all the time, and yet somehow it feels less grounded than This Is How You Lose the Time War. I hate to say this, but it was kind of just whatever for me. On a different day, I could see myself rating this higher. I don't really see myself caring enough to pick it up and give it another try. Next we have Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid, another historical novel. The year is 1980 and we're following Joan, who applies to be one of the first female scientists to join NASA's space shuttle program. She's accepted into the program, but she still has to undergo a bunch of rigorous trainings and pass all the tests to hopefully be one of the lucky few who gets sent into space. And while she's juggling all of that, she's also dealing with the needs of her often neglected niece and the unexpected connection with Vanessa, an engineer in the program. Oh, how I wish I had more positive things to say about this. I've been trying to recreate the magic that I had with Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones, and nothing has hit like that since. I will say that I liked Atmosphere more than Malibu Rising. The thing with Taylor Jenkins Reid's books is that I never want to say that they're bad, because they're absolutely not. It's just that they're for a very specific kind of reader. And if you're not that specific reader, you're not going to enjoy the experience. And it is a gamble every single time, because I loved Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones, but I was extremely disappointed by Malibu Rising. You either love the book or you're fatally bored by it. I was 80% bored here. I found it just okay for the most part, with some snippets that were really fantastic, and I think it's because the book needed a tighter focus. It wasn't just about two female astronauts joining NASA and finding love, which I think is the aspect that drew most of us to reading Atmosphere in the first place. It's also a ton about Joan's niece and her maternal love for her and the journey that their relationship goes through. And there were so many tangents. Like, nothing could happen without Joan going on an internal monologue for paragraphs on end about some science thing or another. And obviously, as an astronaut, she has feelings about space. I accept that. Some of the science facts, super interesting actually. And not only the science facts, I was also interested in her thoughts on humans' place in the world and how God and science intersect. But it happens far too often in sometimes odd places. Like, Joan will be looking at somebody's ring, and mid-dialogue we get paragraphs about how there is a material stronger than diamonds and how language is how we communicate, before Joan finally responds to the person. And then on top of that, some of the tangents get a little too preachy for my taste. It felt like the tangents were less about the characters and developing the plot and the characters themselves, and more like Taylor Jenkins Reid herself just wanted to wax poetic about space and science. Some of that is expected for a book about astronauts, but it just went on for too long, too often. And besides the tangents, the prose itself also felt like it generally went on for too long. It felt like the book insisted on doing the thinking for you instead of just giving you the interactions as they are and giving you the space to interpret how each relationship works. And despite the way it over-explained many things, I also at the same time felt like it under-explained other things. Namely, I don't feel like we got to know Vanessa enough. Her character to me felt quite patchy, if that makes sense. It's frustrating because I could see glimpses of what could have been a gripping story had it been written more tightly and possibly by a different author. We have chapters that take place in December 1984 when some of our characters are up in space and things go sideways, like critically and terrifyingly sideways. And then the other chapters start in 1980 up until 1984, starting with the characters applying for the NASA program and going through the program. The ratio is like one chapter in 1984 and then 3 chapters in the past timeline. The, let's call it present timeline, and the past timeline felt like 2 separate books. The past timeline was pretty slow paced. It's where most of my criticisms come from, even though it's also where most of the romance happens. But it's also one of those dual timeline stories where I have such a clear preference for one timeline that I'm kind of just putting up with one timeline until we could get back to the other one. I just wanted to get back to the space mission gone wrong. The present timeline chapters were so gripping. They were way more tense. Every best moment in the book happened during the present timeline chapters. Had we had more of those chapters, had it been more of a central focus, had the ratio between past and present been flipped, the book would have had me on the edge of my seat. I would have been way more locked in emotionally. There were moments where I loved the romance. It felt representative of what it feels like to be a sapphic woman discovering what it's like to love a woman. It was at times beautiful and romantic. It especially tugged at the heartstrings during the final chapter. Just prepare yourself for that. But overall, it felt like the romance lacked sincerity or depth. Taylor Jenkins Reid knows all of the right things to say, all of the common things that I think queer people experience, but it feels like it stays on the surface. It feels like it was studied rather than lived. And listen, I don't know anything about Taylor Jenkins Reid or her sexuality, and it doesn't really matter what her sexuality is either, because I think a straight person can write an LGBT romance that feels lived in just as much as an LGBT person can write a story that feels more studied and distant. It's just about how raw a story feels to the reader, and for me, it didn't feel raw at all. In the beginning, I didn't even see the chemistry between our 2 love interests. It felt like more acquaintances trying to figure out how to get comfortable with each other than the first embers of a romance. It doesn't help that I also found the dialogue unnatural at times. I feel like I'm about to convince myself to drop this book down a half star, but I genuinely feel like there are people who would really love this story. If you're really interested in space, if you have your own thoughts on humanity, the universe, how God fits into all of that, like you think about these things often, I don't think you would be bothered by the same things that I was. If you haven't read a ton of sapphic stories before, I think Atmosphere catches some of those feelings pretty accurately, and it does have a bunch of romantic lines. I just feel like other books do it better. And I think people who loved Lessons in Chemistry should read this, which is very ironic and not a guarantee because, spoiler, I gave Lessons in Chemistry 5 stars. But I will say it was interesting to read these books almost back to back because they have a lot of similar themes. And before we move on to the next book, I have a couple of quotes to share with you. "The whole sky makes sense to me now because of you. For the rest of her life, she would think of that area of her body as belonging to Vanessa. We are the universe. I would go so far as to say that as human beings, we are less of a who and more of a when. We are a moment in time, when all of our cells have come together in this body. But our atoms were many things before, and they will be many things after." All right, the next book I'll be talking about is One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar El-Akkad. This is a nonfiction book that I genuinely don't think that I can summarize better than the StoryGraph synopsis does. So, as an immigrant who came to the West, El-Akkad believed that it promised freedom, a place of justice for all. But in the past 20 years, reporting on the war on terror, Ferguson, climate change, Black Lives Matters protests, and more, and watching the unmitigated slaughter in Gaza, El-Akkad has come to the conclusion that much of what the West promises is a lie, that there will always be entire groups of human beings it has never intended to treat as fully human, not just Arabs or Muslims or immigrants, but whoever falls outside the boundaries of privilege. This is a chronicle of that painful realization, a moral grappling with what it means as a citizen of the US, as a father, to carve out some sense of possibility in a time of carnage. Usually I feel iffy giving memoirs ratings unless it's 4 or 5 stars, just to really highlight the good ones. I don't feel iffy here though, because even though it has the memoir tag, I don't really think it is a memoir, or at least it just didn't really feel like one to me. To be candid, I don't have a lot of experience reading memoirs, but based on the ones that I have read, this is more an essay collection that throws in personal experiences occasionally to get you from one thought to another. For some extra context, the writing of this book was inspired, I believe, by the October 2023 bombardment of Gaza, and so the genocide in Palestine is a connecting thread between all of the chapters. The thoughts presented in this book are all good, to be clear. They were just more surface level than I would have wanted them to be. This is very much someone who is upset at the current state of things, of how the genocide in Palestine is being portrayed in media and being brushed aside by the majority of the Western world. El-Akkad is understandably angry and scathing when talking about this. He criticizes people for choosing to forget or ignore what's going on, for choosing to not be inconvenienced rather than advocate for Palestine. All things that I agree with, some that I am still guilty of, to be candid, and deserve to be called out on. But there was nothing here that was a new thought for me. It mostly articulated things that I had already thought or considered, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it does raise the question of who who this book is actually for. I felt like the answer was that this was just for Akkad himself, and if that's the case, fair enough, you should be able to write for yourself. But I would assume that if you're taking the time and energy to get a book published, then you have a specific audience in mind for who should read it. And I just don't know who that audience is. The people most likely to pick up this book, I think, are the people who are in the same place that I'm in. And in that case, this book doesn't bring them any further any which way. Akkad had many criticisms, rightfully so, but I think very little to say about where to go from there. This would perhaps make the most difference to people who have never considered this topic before, or who feel like there is something off about the way people talk about Palestine but can't quite put their finger on it. If those people can be tempted to pick this book up, then that would be great, but I don't think that the marketing of this book will really reach them, and they are just as likely to get defensive and not budge. Akkad does not owe a softening of his thoughts for anybody in order to persuade people to be better people. It's just that we're then brought back to the question of who did the author want to read this book and what did he hope to gain out of it? It feels like this should have been an online essay instead of an entire book. I was ultimately left unsatisfied by this book. I was left wanting more, something deeper, something more well-researched and multi-perspective. I was partially intrigued because I saw that Akkad was a journalist, and so I believed he would bring his skill set to this book and perhaps have done interviews and collected more stories that perhaps hadn't been shared before. This author has had an interesting life for sure, and he has had a front row seat to war and oppression, but I don't recall him mentioning having actually been in Palestine at any point in his life. So the moments when he would talk about Palestine felt like they brought me no closer than I already was. I think I am the same person now that I was before I even read this book. So yeah, it left me wanting more. Consider that a pro of the book, if nothing else. It made me want to read from some Palestinian authors. This is a little interesting to read from an immigrant perspective, thinking about how this relates to my parents' feelings and how I might relate to this differently in the future because I've considered being an immigrant one day. There's a quote that says, "I've been gone so long from the country of my blood that there's really no point, no connection left." That made me think of my mom specifically. It's followed up by a thought regarding how to name and raise your own children when you're an immigrant, and the reasoning behind raising them in the image of the country they're in while distancing them from your home country. I was lucky in the sense that I grew up in South Florida, so you can't really distance yourself from Cuban culture there, but I can see the traces of where my parents prioritized making me an American, and I wonder what their considerations were behind the decisions that they made. There's another quote, "For a life stunted by a particular kind of repression, the driving force will never be towards something better, but away from something worse. The harbor never as safe as the water is cold." This, of course, applies to many countries and people across the world. There are far worse situations than what is happening in the US at the moment, but I, like many other people, I think, relate what I read to my own personal experiences first, which is why this line made me think of how many people have left the US over the past few years. Leaving your home, I think, is never an easy thing, and you can never guarantee that where you're going to is better than where you left. You can only decide that where you are has become intolerable in some way or another, and I can see why people have said that this book articulates feelings that many people at different levels are experiencing right now. This is also interesting from the perspective of someone who studied journalism and was a news reporter for a few years. Akkad talks often about how the way events are spoken about in the media can not only permit but encourage people to look the other way and not confront the brutality of what's going on around the world. I have nothing to say besides that this is true, obviously. I've seen word choice be nitpicked and softened in the newsroom, but I was lucky enough that for the most part the newsrooms that I was in found it insulting to soften the blow of what's happened. I also have a few quotes to share for this book. The empire as well is cocooned inside its own fortress of language, a language through the prism of which buildings are never destroyed but rather spontaneously combust, in which blasts come and go like chinooks over the mountain, and people are killed as though to be killed is the only natural and rightful ordering of their existence. It is a hallmark of failing societies, I've learned, this requirement that one always be in possession of a valid reason to exist. As their eradication continues, they must transform into the worst human beings on earth, the weight of their deaths only then sufficiently lightened. How empty does your message have to be for a deranged right wing to even have a chance of winning? Of all the epitaphs that may one day be written on the gravestone of Western liberalism, the most damning is this: faced off against a nihilistic, endlessly cruel manifestation of conservatism, and somehow managed to make it close. All right, we are on to the 4 stars with The River Has Roots by Amal El-Mohtar. This is a short little book about 2 sisters who live in a small town on the edge of the fairy realm. Esther and Isabel love each other very much, and they always thought that they would live together forever, tending to their family's enchanted willows, until Esther falls in love with someone from the fairy realm. And now the sisters have to learn how to say goodbye and keep an eye out for a persistent suitor that Esther rejected. This book is by one of the authors of This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is an all-time favorite book for me, so I I was really anticipating reading this one. It didn't disappoint per se. It just didn't dazzle or stun me the way that Time War did, and to be fair, that is a really high bar. This is a much more contained, smaller story than This Is How You Lose the Time War, which makes it perfectly suited for people seeking something cozy, comforting, easy on the eyes, and easy on the soul as well. I actually think it's more suited for fans of T. Kingfisher than it is for fans of This Is How You Lose the Time War. Very fairy tale-esque in its writing style. It's written as if the story is being told to you orally, with lines directing the storyline, such as, "But we were speaking of the Hawthorne family, weren't we?" It has a lot of the pros and cons of a classic fairy tale. It's whimsical and fun, comforting in its predictability because you can usually see where a fairy tale storyline is going to go, but the characters are pretty one note. They can be pretty much boiled down to one or two characteristics per character. The villain is cartoonishly villainous. I don't really get people who say that there is strong character development in this story, because the choices that the characters make at the end of the book are exactly the same decisions that they would make at the beginning of the story. To be fair, a lack of strong character development, I think, is a common drawback in short stories, or rather, it's not something that people who pick up short stories are necessarily looking for anyway. The River Has Roots tells a really sweet story about sisterly love. There is romantic love too, as you can tell by the premise, and it is at times butterfly-inducing, but the main point is the love and devotion between the sisters. I thought that was a nice subversion from the usual expectation that fairy tales will focus more on romantic love rather than platonic love. This book instead gives the same importance and weight to both kinds of love. It writes platonic love as enchanting and heart-clenchingly sweet, with an almost reverence that I think writers often don't give anything outside of romantic love. It's a lovely little story. All of the drawbacks that I can think of for the story are just part of the nature of a short fairy tale, so if that's what you're seeking, I don't think my criticisms should stop you from picking this book up. My biggest actual critique is that the magic system is so unexplained. It's a grammar-based magic system that connects the idea of language and conjugation changing the meaning of words to the idea of magic actually changing things from one thing to another. It was entertaining seeing magic being explained using grammar terms, but it was so unexplained in how it actually works. Some people will be unbothered by that. It is sometimes amusing to see a fairy tale that just says whatever it wants, no explanation, and you're just supposed to accept that that is how the world works in that universe. But in this case, I just found it frustrating. The grammar terms were just there, but it was hard to grasp what the point of the grammar influence even was. How did it being grammar-based make it different from any other magic system? It felt like grammar terms were just arbitrarily chosen to describe the magic, and not as if grammar and magic were intrinsically linked and informed by each other. Like, it didn't feel like you needed to understand grammar to make magic work, if that makes sense. It was doing the bare minimum to claim that it was grammar-based magic, which I found very disappointing because I was very excited about that aspect. Still, this was a sweet, easy story to read. Give it a try whenever you're in the mood to like curl up and unwind for a night. Under the right circumstances, I could see myself giving it 5 stars if I was like, I don't know, feeling particularly tender or sentimental about my own relationship with my sister. And now we're on to the final book and my one and only 5-star of the year so far, God willing. I hope there are more. We've got Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. This is a 1960s historical fiction following Elizabeth Zott, a talented chemist, not that her all-male co-workers at the Hastings Research Institute see it that way. The all-male team is as you would expect for a 1960s man, with rare exceptions. They see her as just another woman that can't be as smart as them, and when she proves to be even smarter, Hastings feels threatened and upset, enough so to push Elizabeth out. She couldn't have predicted where she'd end up a few years later, a single mother and the star of a cooking TV show called Supper at 6, where her scientific approach to cooking enamors the whole country. Let me start by saying that I love this book. I am not so biased as to not see its potential flaws, but I really truly did not care about a single one of them. I will, however, do my best to mention them. So much of this book is about the misogyny women faced, about all the barriers women face from society, telling them that they are just meant to be housewives, to the men in schools who will take advantage of them, to the people at work who will devalue them and never see them as anything more than a body. Infuriating to read at times, actually made my stomach twist with anger. Elizabeth from the start is someone who cares about holding on to her identity. She doesn't want to apologize for it. She doesn't want to compromise it. As a woman, society is always trying to take her identity away from her by insisting that she marry and change her last name, and by pushing her to become a housewife and a mother instead of a chemist. There's a lot of casual cruelty and judgment from people in this book. You get the worst that a woman going against society gets. Well, Not exactly the worst. I'll get into that later. Rape and sexual assault are important trigger warnings for this book. I would consider it moderately present. It happened, it's somewhat described, and it's not sugar-coated, but it's not lingered on either. It's over in a span of a page or two, I think. So you have these large attacks on women, but you also have the little things throughout the story. You have the jabs, the judgments, the gossip. It is so pervasive and frustrating to see how people want to tear a woman down. Early on, we are also introduced to the child mentioned in the synopsis. I know some people might think that that cheapens the message. A woman like Elizabeth Zott, who says that she doesn't want children, ends up with a child anyway. And I totally understand how some people would be upset by that, and that would be a deal breaker for them. They wouldn't want to read the story past that. I don't think it cheapens the story, however, because I think the message here is more so about living life in the way that you want, in being a mother, and so much more in the way that you want, not in the way the world dictates women should. For Elizabeth Zott, I think there's also a lesson here in learning to adapt to what life brings you and continuing to strive for fulfillment regardless of what happens. And all of this makes it sound like Lessons in Chemistry is really emotional and heavy, and don't get me wrong, it does get really emotional, but it doesn't feel like those books that are written for the sole purpose of bringing you down and making you cry. It stays relatively light, even with all the topics that it touches on, because its focus is more so on continuing to move forward through life. The writing style also really sets the tone that you maybe wouldn't expect from the description that I've given so far. I always feel inadequate describing writing styles, but I do really love this one. It's very blunt, almost apathetic and insensitive in its recounting of facts. Elizabeth Zott has depression, for example. That is just a fact, and the narrator is not ascribing any emotion or judgment to that. The narrator tells you things, makes observations, and leaves it to you to make of it what you will. The tone is sardonic, bordering on cynical, but mostly realistic. Are the events themselves realistic all the time? No, absolutely not. I can't imagine any woman in 1960 coming out as unscathed as Elizabeth Zott does, considering how much she refuses to conform. But maybe you can say that it's balanced out by the fact that she has white privilege. Some people are going to think that this book hits you over the head with a message, but I've never been a person that's bothered by a heavy-handed approach so long as it's done with sincerity, and this book is so earnest and honest with its feelings. You may also read the synopsis and hear what I've said so far and think that this is going to be very white feminism, and I can't lie, that is a valid criticism to have of this book. Race is briefly mentioned in the story. Elizabeth is explicitly not racist, in a time where I guess that was bold to say, and she takes the time during her TV show to mention how stupid it is for race to be a barrier to science and to mention the civil rights movement. All important, but not touched upon enough for anyone to really feel like this book touches on the intersection of race and class with gender. I'm sure people will also be annoyed by the fact that Elizabeth is a white woman who is considered very pretty, but doesn't consider her own appearance very much, and is perhaps presented too much like she is not flawed so much as society is flawed for thinking that she is. I personally think that those things aren't overt enough to detract from everything beautiful about the story, but if all of those things are deal breakers for you, I would 100% recommend watching the show instead of reading the book. The show has a civil rights side plot that is way more important to the story and results in more conversation about how white people, regardless of gender, are privileged and don't always see it. In the show, you also see Elizabeth as more of a flawed person. The slightly shifted plot gives us an opportunity to see Elizabeth put in the work to be a good person and sometimes falter and have to fix that. I love the show. It's very true to the book. The changes that it makes only improves the story tenfold. I love both versions so much that I think one day it would be interesting to maybe do a separate video comparing them more so that I could talk about the show more, but they are very similar. Elizabeth is similarly portrayed in both of them. She's autistic coded as fuck, blunt, practical, very science minded, but sincere with her affections and her belief in people's capacity to be better. There is a romance in this story that is so sweet. It moves fast because they just click, but it's sweet. It's the picture of devotion at times. It's romantic in a deeply domestic and steadfast kind of way. It had me squealing at times. I loved the romance so much. But to be clear, this is not a romance book, okay? And I have to give a criticism here because I think this love interest too often steamrolls her and infantilizes her. And maybe this was purposeful, intentionally meant to show his naivety and to show that even this guy who is great and forward thinking for his time had work to do to be a better person. There's also a found family aspect that I love. We start the story with two people who are so deeply lonely, who were lucky enough to find each other, and then we end up building brick by brick a beautiful family and a beautiful community. Also, I think this is going to really matter to some people. There is a dog. The dog is an important active character in the book. There is a POV chapter from the dog. Lessons in Chemistry is just a blend of random things, and I'm sure there's a thought here about how life is a patchwork of things that make an identity and a story, and the steps that lead to each new patch are unpredictable and serendipitous. this. It would be remiss of me not to mention that grief and depression are both things that are explored in this story, and it does make for some heavy scenes sometimes. But basically, the message, I think, is life is unpredictable. It can't be planned for, but you can have the courage to continue living and making the most out of what you're handed. I think housewives should read this. I think any woman who chafes under society's expectations and demands and moreover degradation should read this. It won't change your world. It probably won't even make you feel like your heart has been carved out or anything. But what it will feel like is having a cup of coffee with a friend who gets it because they have lived through it too. And more than that, it feels like a friend who wholly believes in your capacity to be more than what other people say you are and more than you yourself believe you are capable of. It's said both lovingly with this quote, Elizabeth simply refused to accept limits, not just for herself, but for others, but also as a criticism with this idea. The truth is, we are very much responsible for the badness in the world, and we have the power to fix it. I mentioned earlier that the writing style is very blunt, very apathetic. That is true, and yet this is a total contradiction. It somehow manages to be very loving at the same time. The facts are what they are, but you are capable of working towards better facts, and there are people who will sit with you while you do it. This book really tugged at my heartstrings. I don't care how heavy-handed it was. It brought me near tears more than once. And of course, I have some quotes for you from this one. The 30-year-old mother of Madeline Zott rose before dawn every morning and felt certain of just one thing: her life was over. The first kiss cementing a permanent bond that even chemistry could not explain. "We should get some sleep," she said, not yawning. "We can talk about this another time," he said, depressed. "Maybe tomorrow," she lied. It wasn't that he couldn't function without her, but rather that he didn't see the point of functioning without her. The baby was snatching her internal organs like suitcases as if to ensure she'd have plenty to wear on the outside. "One would think the ignorant would die off sooner," Elizabeth continued, but Darwin overlooked the fact that the ignorant rarely forget to eat. And on that note, that's how my reading year started. For future wrap-ups, let me know if you have a preference for how they're organized, if we do by rating again, or if you'd rather see it by genre or in the order in which I read the books, in case you're wondering if I had like a really slump bad period of reading or if I managed to get some great books back to back. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm especially interested to know if you have any opinions on the books that I've soft DNF'd. Maybe you can convince me one way or another if I should pick them up again or if I should just give up on them now. I will see you in the next one.